So I just start recording. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the IIT Social Sciences Great Problems, Great Minds Seminar Series. I'm Hao Huang, Assistant Professor of Social Sciences. For today's seminar, you can submit questions during the webinar by typing in the chat box. We will open the floor to questions at the end of the webinar. Today's speaker is Professor Helen Couclelis. And Dr. Helen Couclelis is a professor of geography emeritus at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And she holds a doctorate from the University of Cambridge. Prior to joining the geography department at UC Santa Barbara, she spent several years as a professional planner and a policy advisor in Greece. She has held visiting appointments at the Department of Civil Engineering of the University of Baltimore, the Institute of Urban and Regional Development of the University of California at Berkeley, and the Woodrow Wilson School of Princeton University. Her research and writing range quite widely, including urban and regional geography and modeling, spatial cognition, and the geography of information society. Along with more abstract pursuits, such as the methodologies of cellular automata and agent-based models. The role of error and uncertainty in forecasting issues related to the concept of spatial temporal information and the philosophy of science. Her research has made fundamental contributions to advancing the theory and the philosophy of geoscience in ways that distinguish her contributions from many of the standard developments in the field. She has reflected on the ways in which space and time are represented and integrated in state-of-the-art contributions to GIS science, focusing on making the science relevant to a wide range of applications. His involvement with geographic information science and other forms of representing space and process reflect her academic and professional background, which bridges the social sciences and the synthetic sciences of civil engineering, architecture, and urban and regional planning. Honors include an honorary doctorate from the Utrecht University, the Netherlands in 1999, and a lifetime research award from the University Consortium for Geographic Information Science in 2018. It's very delighted to welcome to Professor Helen Couclelis to give us a talk.
Well, thank you very much for this introduction, Professor Huang. Really, it was a bit more than I expected for people to hear about me, but we are ready to move on now. And I think I will, let me make a just very quick test. If I do this, can you hear it?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, so that would be one way for you to get around this horrible problem we ran into. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining. I would like to make you aware that this is going to be a presentation unlike many others you have watched in this series. And this is because the other presentation in this series that I watched are very professional and very quantitative, and they show you data, and they show you all the good things that social scientists and others have to take into account. This presentation here will be speculative, um, and there will be no data I can show you. Of course, we're speculating about the future, and we don't have any data about the future. And so what I try to do is to just give you a overview of some issues that are being discussed very intensely in some cases, and that in fact affect us all who live in cities of any kind, anywhere, I suppose. So after this, let me get going with the actual slides after. Next, please.
Okay, it's the one with the Ben Wilson picture.
Yeah, this is the official cover slide, is the one with the picture. And I'd like to see the next one.
Yeah, it's the complex and mental complex of cities.
Right. That's his next one. Yeah.
So do you want me show this one, right? The mental complex of cities?
Okay, so the meta complexity of cities. Sorry about the hiatus. I was expecting to see it myself. Um, the way you see it, but of course I could not. That's the whole point. Anyway, yeah, just to put things in perspective, of course, cities are extremely complex for very many reasons. In fact, they are so complex that I recently used the term meta complexity of cities, that is a complexity of complexities. And just a few things to remind you how very strange and complex cities are. On the one hand, they are made of asphalt and concrete. On the other hand, they grow and change, which asphalt and concrete doesn't do normally. There are places, but also networks. They are spatial temporal objects, but they're also about people. They're physical structure, but they're also institutions of citizenship. They may be small enough to fit within a square mile or less, and some of them can be larger than many small countries, Fiji or the Vatican. And of course, lately, in recent times, they can also be actual and virtual. So I'm now moving to my next slide.
Two perspective on the post-pandemic cities.
Right. In the abstract that you probably saw, I'm talking about two perspectives on the post-pandemic city. And one is that there will be significant fundamental reorganization of cities after the pandemic. And the other is that nothing much changes. So I call the first one "Distance is Dead" because it is based on the notion that distance no longer matters. And the other one I call "Resilience" because which is the argument that no matter what happens, the city bounces back. So in the first case, we'll deal with these two perspectives separately. And in the first case, the basic argument is that there will be further ICT developments, information and communication technology developments in making communication over distance easier. Most work, at least a large percentage of the work, will be remote. That will lead to hollowed out city centers, when people no longer fill the offices. What's going to happen to all the services and businesses that were depending on these people, from the from the coffee shop to the sandwich shop to other kind of shops that people would visit during the lunch break. So there will be suburban and exurban growth. Family relations will change because women will probably prefer, there is information of that women would prefer, most of them, to work from home, whereas uh, uh, husbands less so, the men less so, and so there will be stresses there. And of course, for the same reason, the class differences will increase. We'll have those who have the privilege of working from home and those who don't. So that's one side. The other, the resilience side, is that, there have been trends during the pandemic, pre-pandemic trends that will continue as before. The office work will still dominate, even though there will be certainly a higher proportion than before of people working remotely. The centers will maintain their abstraction. The younger, the cohorts between 25 and like 50 years old will prefer urban life as being more interesting. Arts and entertainment will thrive. The economy will recover stronger than before. And of course, there are many other parts to the argument, whether what is better for the environment and so on. We don't have time to get into this. So I'm moving on to the next one, which is the cover slide for the first perspective. The distance is dead. And I think the term first appeared in an issue of the Economist, the venerable British publication. And one of their people working for them, Francis Cairncross, had had published that article, The Death of Distance, that became very, very famous. And eventually she developed that in a book. So what you see is the cover of the book that is still available from many places if you want it. Okay, so let's talk about distance a little bit. Distance is something that regional scientists and geographers and planners love, because without distance, their jobs, their occupations, their interests could not exist. And in fact, I have taught urban geography for first-year students for a long time. And one of the things we always talk about is how distance is absolutely central to everything that geography and regional science does. And here is a series of model names, mathematical models, that were first developed around the beginning of the quantitative revolution in geography, late 40s, early 50s, and so on. And I don't need to read to you the entire list, but there was distance as determinant of interaction between people, distance as generation of spatial equilibrium between demand and supply, distance as an economic cost, distance to do how can you be used to adjust profitability, distance as a developmental handicap. If you're on the periphery, which is far from the city, then it's a handicap. And let's not worry about these models, other than to say that these are the The original forms were very, very simple, but all these are still around uh, with, much more sophisticated forms and much more applicable in real life. So, and yet, despite all that talk about the importance of distance, we know how people stay at home and continue working just as before on their regular jobs. They have businesses that can move part of their operations overseas and still function more efficiently than when everything was in the same building. Professional and social relations that can be established and maintained across the globe. And so the glue that was holding cities together, that used to be the need to overcome the friction of distance, as we say, that is the difficulty of overcoming distance for the purpose of communication, that's gone too. So what is left now? What now? Now, looking back in history, urban history, a little bit, or maybe far into the past, we find that there was also a friction between people loving cities and people hating cities, what I call the perennial love-hate affair of humans with cities. And, um, and very certainly during at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, you had people leaving the cities to avoid the polluted air and the disease. You had the garden city movements in the 20s and 30s, started in Britain, expanded to the US. You had in the 30s the famous architect Frank Lloyd Wright, who, who proposed the concept of the broadacre city, which would be well, wouldn't really call a city, but a region whereby plot, the smallest lot would be 1 acre large. And from there up, it could be anything depending on the needs and whether it would be for residences or for industry or for any other urban. So everything very, very spread out. And of course, everybody would have cars. And it looks like they would also have flying saucers for getting from one side to the other. So he didn't really mean it as an idea that could be implemented, but one way of addressing the desire for more land that most people have, the desire for safer places to rear children. And during the Cold War, there was a fear of being the target of nuclear bombs if you lived in a big city like New York, for example. New York just did not become the target of nuclear bombs, but it certainly got a target of much destruction in 9/11. And of course, also longing for open nature. So it's an old story that is being repeated in a different guise these days. And it's not just this past of the friction between triple and between the city and the non-city places, but we have these quotes that go back to the oldest one in this collection that I have here in this slide. There are many more. Uh, is attributed to Melvin Weber, which was the grand old man of urbanism at Berkeley in the 60s and 70s. And back in the cities, he wrote that it might be possible to locate on a mountaintop and to maintain intimate, real-time, and realistic contacts, blah, blah, blah. All persons tapped into the global communications network which have ties approximating those used in a given metropolitan region. And this is amazing because 64, there was no internet, no email. There were telephones and there were computers and there were faxes. And so these thinkers had extended these possibilities to the kinds of things we see today. And then there are many other interesting ones as well from the 80s. The area of the computer and the communication satellite is inhospitable to the high-density city. In many ways, if cities did not exist, it now would not necessary to invent them. In urban terms, when time becomes instantaneous, space becomes unnecessary. That's an interesting philosophical one as well. And many more if you go to that source, the cyber scientists read, they start in this introduction with a collection of this kind of and of quotes. And so today we have a sense of deja vu talking about the death of cities. And yet, what we find instead is taller and denser cities. Okay, taller and denser is not just in the traditional New Yorks and Londons that we're used to, but even in less developed areas, in China, in Dubai, in Moscow. They have this fantastic business center, new business center, and it looks like a competition as who is going to build a denser city and with the most famous architects. So what we think is happening to cities as opposed to as a relation to the information age and information and communication technology certainly is not reflected in what we see around the world, what's happening with city centers. And here is a quote, another quote that is expresses well why these towers are continuing to be built. I can get 24-hour service for anything in New York. It's terribly important. You want a consultant or technician, you can get them at a moment's notice. I have access to services and people I could never have had if I had moved. Okay, and this is certainly something you will hear from a lot of people who continue to live in places like New York, like Los Angeles, like Houston, Texas, and all the great metropolis like Chicago. And even though there are costs in living in these places, not just financial costs, but you have to live in a tiny apartment or studio, whereas you could have a mansion, further out. So let's see next what happens. What are the complications we get with the distance is dead argument? The fact is that, as other researchers have pointed out, there is really no straight substitution between physical and virtual trips and activities. So there's a list of other things that complicate the issue of distance. One of them is complementarity. So an example is like Starbucks cafes with internet, free internet, attract additional customers, which is physical trips. Then there is the notion of amplification. The moment that the internet and email became widespread, then was an explosion of long-distance conference, and of course physical trips, and many of them were actually flights, very long trips. Why was that? Because it became much easier to organize a conference. Instead of having everything happen through correspondence by paper and by by traditional mail, these decisions and communications could happen instantly. Then you have synergy when you have online companies opening, let's say Apple, opening brick and mortar stores everywhere. And vice versa, you had things that were that started as online, like Amazon, now having brick and mortar stores. And all of these synergies are connected with the possibility of having many more trips than before. And something that we'll talk in a few minutes is another complication, which is the instructional of the original activities. They should have been activities actually in cities, and this will reflect it in something that in a few minutes I will call the fragmentation of activities in space and time, which again is often more tricks. So what's next? Distance is not dead. Distance is not dead because for every process for which distance is dead, for everything that is ours at the click of our mouse, there is another complementary one that obeys the physical principles of hauling matter, including human bodies across space, on which economic geography and regional science are founded. So that's good news for this, for these fields. For example, for every telecommuter working out of her 5G-enabled cottage in the woods or on the Sierras, there is a plumber who needs to have access to the very material blockage in her sewer line. So you can't really get away with just being on your favorite mountain slope, with infinite views and working out as well as you would in the city. And the reason for that is, reminds of Nick Negroponte from the MIT Media Lab, who had written a lot about bits and atoms. Bits, that is the information, the bits on the computer are no replacement for atoms, that is the materiality. Okay, so there is no equivalent to Einstein's E equals mc square for information. There is no equivalent relation between information and materiality. There are critical reciprocal relations between the two. And in fact, this is I hope you can see this cartoon here. It's probably my nicest cartoon I ever included in a presentation. So the pizza baker gets the phone call and says, "Sorry, we can't email your pizza as attachment." Of course we can't. And bits depend on atoms. In order to, you need computers, physical computers, to have the bits. And not vice versa. You can very well have atoms and bodies and cities and tall buildings without having bits. Okay, so this concludes the first part. And let's look at the other kind of argument, which is about the resilience of cities. And here, moving to the arguments there and what we can say about this. Urban areas have always lived with crisis. So just some very obvious example of things that have happened again and again in our country, in many other countries in the world. So you have urban fires. This is, I think, if I remember well, this is the Bay Bridge and Oakland across. There are urban fires. There are urban riots, very often very violent. We have Unfortunately, this is images from Katrina, actually, but these urban floods where people die, we have them all the time. We had them this year, we have them every year. And of course, COVID-19 can be seen just another urban crisis, just like every other pandemic we've had. Some of these are short-lived. Some of these take a few weeks. Some of them have take a long time for the cities to recover, but recover they do. And so, moving on to something instructive, um, talking about pandemics. There have been hundreds of pandemics in history, starting with uh, Athens of 430 BC, the Athens of Pericles, and the Acropolis. And this is actually the first documented pandemic. Uh, Pandemic we have. There was because we have a lot of written materials about that pandemic, which was probably typhoid. Uh, we're not sure. And then skipping several centuries, we go to more familiar things like the Black Death, the Great Plague of London, the first cholera epidemic, the Russian flu. Then in the 20th century, the Spanish flu, the Asian flu, the HIV/AIDS pandemic that eventually became endemic, meaning it is in the community as low key. We have SARS in this century, and we're having COVID in this century. And we're going to have more and more and more. This is a very interesting point that I had, that I came across recently, that I had been thinking about this. And this is a quote from the History magazine. Yet for all the lives lost and changed forever during the Spanish flu, of 1918, it quickly faded from public consciousness. It fell into this black hole of history. It became forgotten. And one reason is that pandemics, once they're gone, they don't really leave a physical trace. Not like 9/11, not like other things, like certainly not like this. I mean, no one's going to forget Nagasaki after the bombing in August of 45. That's not going to be forgotten. But this is Nagasaki today. Now, there is a question there. It's a philosophical question. Is this still Nagasaki? I mean, it has the name. It still has the port function, very much so. It's still inhabited by Japanese people speaking Japanese. It's still on the same site. Is it the same city? Is it the same city? Is Dresden still Dresden? Is Rome still Rome? Is Athens still Rome? We can't get into this kind of discussion, but intuitively people accept that, yeah, this is Nagasaki. I mean, this is what Nagasaki has become today, right? So let's move on to something slightly different there, another aspect. Cities are dying. It's very difficult to kill a city. And there are two principles that are inescapable. There are probably many more. But one of them is the resilience of human nature across the ages. Okay, human nature has not changed. We see this wonderful cave painting done by some beings of over 30 years ago. And we immediately connect with them. Yes, these are humans like ourselves. This is they like these drawings. They could do these drawings, and we love these drawings too. This human nature, and of course, another thing about human nature is that we forget. We forget things that we don't want to remember, or we don't need to remember. So that's one thing, human nature, that among many other things also wants to not be isolated. Humans need company. They don't like living in isolation. We hate the lockdowns. And where is the first place where you find company? You go to city center and you find friends and you hug them. And the other thing, of course, the other constraint that is not changing is materiality. The thing that we are made of atoms and of bits, and that the whole world we live in and work in and live. Now, this is something I mentioned a while ago about the change of urban structure that has already happened during the age of information and communication technologies. And you can look at it at two levels. First of all, the city level, where it is a decoupling between what we call urban activities, which is shopping, living, working, entertaining oneself, educating oneself, and on and on. The things we do in urban environments. And the spaces that are adapted in these places in order to receive these activities. So you have the mall, for example, for shopping. We have the schools for getting educated. We have the you have the amount of words. We have the office for working and so on. And to such an extent that a number of years ago, if you knew where a person was, oh, he's now in the office, therefore they're working. There was such a coupling between these two, and it was also now we're talking as a former planner, it was at the basis of planning that there is that connection between activities and adapted spaces that allow us to plan the city. Now that has started. You can have you can do many things that you used to do in specific places and specific times. You can do them elsewhere. It could be in a plane. It could be in a car. In your car, you could shop when you're working, and so on. And that is the individual level where you have the fragmentation of activity in space and time. So what this diagram shows before ICTs, before information and communication communities, let's say you have 4 activities to complete within a day. And let's take one of them, this one, which could be finishing your homework. You would do this activity in one place at one time, and you'd be done. For the same activity, post-ICT, same activity, you can do it in 2 different places, but you can do it at different times. Okay? So the same activity that had to have a home as a place, now it can be distributed in many places and many times. And this is a complication. And it is a complication because we do, in fact, need new ways of thinking about cities, right? ICTs has significantly added to the fundamental complexity of cities. That's where the meta idea comes from, that it was complex enough as it was. And it is more complex, even more complex, another level of complexity even now. ICTs also suggests for some that we can get rid of cities, and so there is people who think that this is what should be done. And just as I was saying a moment ago, the formally reliable assumptions and methods and models that I talked about now have limitations, distance-based, gravity models, cellular automata, all that stuff. We have to use them differently these days. The structure-based, the relations between activities and structures, and other ways in which the thinking about cities has to change and has changed because of ICTs. And the distance issue is one of them. So not everything stays the same. This is also from The Economist, the revenge in geography. This is the response, the answer to the Death of Distance earlier publication. So, so what is the current state of affairs in our thinking is that there is urban change in the age of ICT. Distance is not dead, but this other thing, it's certainly not the same. Cities are resilient, but they adapt to progress in other areas. The trusted theories and models won't work, so we'll need new things. There are implications for spatial analysis and there are implications for planning and not planning. That's, sorry for the typo here. Which leads to something we really don't have time to talk about, and this is the role for planners and planning, and that is something that I have thought about a little bit, going back to my roots as a professional planner for a while, that planning in the smart city age is going to be different, and that the kinds of plans we're making, assuming the things that have changed, are not going to be possible. And there is one thing that I see as a role for planners in the future, especially at an age with most of the data are held by private companies, be it Facebook, be it Apple, be it whatever other, be it where we shop from, Amazon. The planner will no longer be able to be the person who decides what the city is going to be like. I think the best they could do is be serve as public defenders, that is avoiding for bad things to happen to the city. So reversing things rather than doing the best, avoiding the worst. So summary, and we may not have time for the final thought. So there are two major complications adding to the complexity of cities, changes in the meaning and role of distance, changes in the relations between urban activities and structures. We need to examine, modify, and complement the assumptions, theories, methods, models, tools, and ways of thinking of the modern age. And we have to search for new ideas, and what I had suggested is to look for strategies instead of theories and new roles for planning. Now, I'm afraid I don't have time to go into the planning part. And let's call this the end, so that we can have at least a few minutes for questions after the technological problems we had at the beginning. Okay, so that's the end for me, and I hope I'll get some questions for you. And I'm afraid I can't see the hands, so I hope that I trust that Hal will help us here.
Okay. Thank you so much for this very interesting. Thank Professor Helen Couclelis for this very interesting and also very inspirational talk. So to give us some insights about how the two different the two sides of our arguments about the cities. So the cities distance and also about the resilient cities. So now we will open to the question to see if we have any questions. So one question is from Jeff Terry. So how can we make our cities more resilient?
Well, to some extent, and that was a big part of my argument, resilient cities are resilient by their nature. How we can take them more so? Well, that's a the $1 million question, really. I wish I knew. There's certainly all these crises that I talked about are happening, and they are happening. Sorry about that. They're happening even more often than we would like, partly because of global warming, partly because of international tensions. And for each of these crises, there are smart people who are working on them to mitigate as much as we can. And that's the best we can do. All of us professionals and academics, no matter in which area we are, we can contribute to making these unavoidable crises, at least the ones we know about. There will be crises we never thought about that would come. But to make our best to alleviate so that that humans and the environment and the animals don't suffer. We have a beautiful world and want to keep it as it is.
I also have a question is about I'm wondering when you're talking about the pandemic compared to historical pandemic, to say the current pandemic may not change since the cities is resilient. So I'm wondering, do you think the current pandemic will have some, even is have some like a negative impact, but is there any like create the opportunities rise out of this crisis in terms of the people's behavior and how actually the people's behavior at the individual level will actually change the city's activities at the city level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, one problem with the title, which is deliberate, it's that it is ambiguous. The post-pandemic city, what does that mean? What is the post-pandemic city? Is it a prototype city that we expect to find out? Is it the city of the Western world as opposed to everybody else? Is it a city that could really dissolve into fragments of smaller urban areas, smaller cities, rather than a central city? So depending on how you interpret that term, there might be different answers of what people can do and how they should behave. And as I say, I don't have even though I'm a great mind according to your series designation, I don't have a crystal ball to tell you what new challenges and what people's choices are going to be. That's, but this is something. It's a good question because all of us can think about it and see what we think.
So regarding what you said, the people's behavior may not that predictable, and then how do you see the companies their behaviors or what they are created actually is change because people's behaviors demands change to cause or to lead to some industrial change is
Right. Yeah.
different from the previous,
Yeah.
very different from pre-pandemic age.
Right. So people's behavior does change. What doesn't change is human's nature. It's not the same thing. Behavior adapts. We are very adaptable animals, and we can live in environments that are very far from what we know, and we love traveling to places that are very, very different, and we some of us even decide to stay there. So in the case of businesses, in the relation of people with businesses, a number of people prefer, it's not clear what percentage. It used to be the case that maybe around 10% of people were already working remotely. Maybe it was higher than that. There is this notion that now that we know how to do it, and now that the technology is perfected to allow us to do it efficiently, we'll be doing even more than that. On the other hand, you have businesses to say no. Not every business says that, but they say no, you have to come to the office. Because the kind of behavior of a worker at the office is very different from it is at home working from a computer. And for people themselves, in many cases, choose to be at the office because if they're not, the people at the office will forget about them. The administration may think that you're staying at home because you don't really interested in working very well. You won't learn the latest news at the water trough. There are many. You can do either or, work at home or at the office, but there are many advantages to working at the office. And from the business owners and companies, there are many advantages of having you around.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I agree. So I think based on that, I believe after the pandemic, people will enjoying both the advantage of convenience created by the technology during the pandemic, and also at the same time also back to like in-person interaction, people can have more communications. So I think that would be you mentioned just now have both advantage and in the two sides.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think I have one question from the Fu Ying Professor. Hey, Professor Couclelis, thanks for the thought-provoking presentation. My name is Fu Zhenying, studying urban planning. I have a question
great.
about the planner's role as the public defender. Would you mind to elaborate a little bit on the point? Do you prefer public defender as the defender of public life that happened in physical spaces, as the position Jane Cobb takes to defend the diversity of urban vitality?
Right. Yeah. Well, as a statement, it's a bit extreme to say that that they won't be able to plan. Planners will be able to plan, but not in the traditional way. I mean, I grew up at the time of comprehensive planning. Okay, that for one thing, that was for several years, maybe a few decades, the thing in parts of Europe where I grew up, and it continued in the UK and the Netherlands. Planners really did decide and were able to implement the decisions about how people should live in cities. You know how they, yes, of course, we have public participation, all of that, but but the planners were still steering the boat. Um, you know what? This was not the case in the US. We never really had um, a culture of liking planners very much. Too individualist, we don't want anybody tell us what to do and how to live and so on. But the thing is that with all this, I'm not saying pandemic changes because there haven't really been very many. What we've had is amplification of certain things. For example, if it was 15% of people were working at home before, it may be 25% now. But and this changes at some point will be noticeable at the urban level. When you no longer have when you can no longer have shops, big and small, at the center of the city because nobody's in the offices at the center of the city. That will change. But in the meantime, I think it will be at even as a speculation, because I like speculations, to imagine that city, the changes in the city, they don't have to be dramatic, but they can be so fluid that you don't have control as what's going to happen, especially when so much of what happens to the city doesn't depend on the city itself and its administration, but there are influences that come from the global network of cities, right? From globalization effects. So in situations like this, when you have companies from China or from India or from Brazil or wherever coming to found a big factory next to the city and change the entire local economy, you probably cannot do much about that as a planner, but what you could do is make sure that that factory that's going to bring all these wonderful new jobs is going to be in the right place. It's not going to be polluting. It's not going to cause other kinds of problems in the city. But planners are no longer the owners of the city in the sense that they can't do with it what they like if they put it. That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
So for the next question is Jeff Terrell. In Chicago, we did things like raising drawbridges during riots. How do we determine if these choices increase or decrease resilience?
Could you repeat, please? I didn't understand. I didn't get it.
In Chicago,
Mhm.
we did things like raising drawbridges during riots. how do we determine if these choices increase or decrease resilience?
There's something about bridges.
The river draw bridges during the rains. I
That's
think it's
the word I don't get after bridges. Doing the what?
the draw bridges. The river
Oh, the river. Yes,
above the
yes,
river
yes.
draw bridges.
Or drawbridges.
Yeah, during the rains. So
Right, right, right.
I
Yes.
think it's Jeff. Did you mean like a Black Lives Matter that riots?
Right. I heard about that, and it's very interesting. And that is one way of mitigating crises. You know, if you can, in the case of riots, for example, if you can isolate the violence and the disturbance to one area, it's bad for that area, but it's better for the rest of the city as opposed to have it spread throughout. So this is mitigation, and but on the other hand, these are things that come and go, and it's not possible to predict everything that can happen in this sense. But mitigation it is, and it was, and somebody had a very clever idea, and of course the also the technical means to do that. It's not longer the case. The question of where I live in California, the question of wildfires has been around ever since California existed, but it's getting worse because the population has doubled since I came to California, some 30 odd years ago. And 95% of ignitions, there's no fire without ignition. 95% of ignitions are human based. So the more people you put in, for ignitions, the more ignitions they're going to be. That's not surprising. The question was, what do you do? Do you tell people, please go back where you came from because you're causing too many fires? You can't do that. So what kind of mitigation is possible there? There are ways of dealing with mistakes in our dealing of forests, too much underbrush that has not burned for a very long time, if ever. But when it comes to urban fires, sorry, I live in the foothills in the city of Santa Barbara, and the fire is so high that no company wants to insure my houses. Can you believe that? Yeah, I, I'm I am insured with a foreign company who I suppose doesn't know how bad it is. So how can we mitigate these kinds of risks? And this is one way that planners can prevent the worst to happen. As opposed to to building the ideal city, in my view. But yeah, and it's such an interesting area, isn't it? Both urban geography in itself, the descriptive urban analysis kind of thing, what you find, and then how planners can use these findings to think differently, differently, because the world is changing, not just because of ICT, but because of a lot of other things. The distribution of poverty, environmental things.
I think another question is from Yuan Ji. Hello, Professor. I major in architecture. I wonder what architecture and also as for mentioned urban planning approaches, do you think can benefit to enhance the urban resilience? Maybe like proposal sought to blend the cities more into nature.
Well, for somebody with an architectural background, like myself and a lot of other people who eventually also became planners. I mean, this is the ideal kind of project to have, you know, to figure out the things that you talk about. Um, I'm not sure if the question is whether it is still doable to find the best way of having people live in green environments without destroying the city. And it is. There are many people who are trying to do that, who are trying to put the open environment even inside the house. You know, there is a very well-known architect and planner called Arati from MIT, and I'm getting his newsletters from time and over. The last one I saw, um, he built a city. He built this house. He built a house with two trees actually in the house, not cut trees, you know, rooted inside the house in the living room. And he's done other things with obviously green terraces and roofs. Um, now roofs are used for solar panels more than greenery, but certainly roofs with greenery were very fashionable at the time. Walls where some plants can, you know, flowery plants or even grapevines can climb on. Um, these are also there are. I do no longer think like an architect as much as I used to, but there are possibilities and they are very, very attractive and feasible.
Okay, thank you. So, um, okay, and thank you so much for this very wonderful talk. It really gave us many insights and inspirations about what will be after pandemic. So usually we give applause to the talker at the end. So thank you so much for your talk. It's a very honor to have you to give us such a great talk.
Thank you very much, Hal. I'm sorry about the technical glitch that stole a lot of our time. And of course, thank everybody who participated and listened and thought and asked good questions. For me, other than the kind of nervous beginning, it was an excellent experience, and I'm so glad that and I'm so proud to be part of this series of talks.
Yeah. I remember you mentioned you're kind of afraid to have some like techniques based on the previous experience. But I think for today's your slides, people will definitely seeing the slides well for your talk. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you again, everybody. And yes, we may meet physically or otherwise some other time. Yeah.
Yeah. Hope we can invite you in the future to visit us.
Well, that'd be nice to be twice a great mind. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much.
Okay.
And again, sorry for the.
No. It's very
don't know what
interesting.
happened, and
Definitely,
that's
it's
very
very
frustrating.
interesting. It's very interesting
As
to.
an engineer, I should have figured out what the problem was. But
Okay.
okay, bye bye
Thank
now.
you. Bye.